Welcome to another Bible prophecy video with Pastor Tom Elseroad. Have your Bibles ready as we dig deeper into God's holy word.
Father, thank you so much for loving us. Thank you for providing this evening, and we pray that it's a blessing, and we just pray that you are honored through it. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, so a couple people, 3 I think, have actually seen most of it. I updated a little bit of changes to what we did. But we did this earlier this year, actually, if I remember right. Was it earlier this year? Whenever we did this, whenever we went through Matthew 24, 25, and I think it was like March or April, whatever that was, somewhere around April. I think it was around busy time, wasn't it? Yeah. So that's what it was. So what we did, we were going through Matthew 24 and 25. We kind of stepped through those, but then in the midst of that, when we started out the study, was actually with this guy. And so I want to talk about the next temple in Jerusalem. Then I actually added City of David. And there is a distinction. And so I think you're going to see how that's important. Because a lot of people have this impression that the thing called the Temple Mount is indeed where the original temple was. And we're going to see a bunch of things from Scripture and a number of historians that basically disprove that altogether. So people get all worked up over the Muslim mosque, and then the Dome of the Rock is up there and all that. And they go, well, the temple's got to be there. Well, does it really? No, I think if it's going to be anywhere, it's going to be in the original site. And we'll talk about those passages as we go on. So I put the next temple. And so where we get that is, of course, a lot of passages, Daniel and Daniel 9, Matthew 24, 15, Jesus talked about quoting from Daniel. 2 Thessalonians 2, which actually 2 Thessalonians 2 is the one that actually uses the word temple. If we're going to, let me look up a quick verse here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4. 2 Thessalonians 2:4, talking about the Antichrist. Let me start with verse 3. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, the day of Christ, the day of the Lord, the day that it's a positive for believers, it's a negative for unbelievers. For that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Then he says, concerning the Antichrist, this man of sin, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Okay, so we go, well, but there's no temple, right? So we're reading something that's going to happen in the future, that the conditions of which are not there yet, because he's not able to sit in the temple of God, proclaimed to be God, and demand worship, which is something he will demand that will take place. But our main passage today is going to be Matthew 24, just the 2 verses that gets us started introducing this. And so, Matthew 24, verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. They were pretty amazed, and they were pretty awestruck by how cool the temple was. Right? They were telling they're trying to tell Jesus how awesome the temple is. Jesus' response in verse 2 says, and Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Well, of course they do. They just pointed it out. It's kind of funny. He asked that question, but he's really trying to get their attention. Yeah, they're pointing out how awesome the temple is. He says, do you not see all these things? He said, assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Right? So the implication is Jesus is, in a couple of verses, in verse 15, he's going to talk about the Antichrist breaking his covenant from, stop the sacrifices and all that, from the temple is where that's going to take place. And right now, they're looking at a temple at this time, right? The second temple. And everyone's got a little handout. We're going to break a little bit more into the temple next week. I want to talk about the Temple Mount this week, and next week more about temples in general, and the number of temples and a lot of details that I think are pretty important. So the temple, there was, of course, the wilderness, the tabernacle, right? That's pretty obvious. That was a tent. It was portable while they were 40 years in the wilderness. But they actually used that for a while until they actually built the temple itself. So they continued to use that for quite some time. Obviously, as you can imagine, over time it was wearing down and wearing down and wearing down, because that would have been about 1446, right? About the time they had that. And so the temple wasn't finished till about 1000, so it could be as much as 400 plus years old, that tabernacle. So it was pretty tattered, I'd imagine, by the time they actually built the temple. So the second one, moving across, of course, is Solomon's temple. That would be the first temple. And again, we'll look at more details that go along with that. The one aspect that we should point out is that in the tabernacle there was what they call the Shekinah glory. The word is actually in the Bible, Shekinah, but it's the glory of God. I mean, it's a Hebrew term, and it means the Shekinah, the glory of God was there. So the glory of God was there in the tabernacle. The glory of God was in Solomon's temple. So that was pretty good. So obviously God was represented by his very presence, by that glory. But then they built remember, it gets torn down, and we're going to look at the details of that, a little bit of it, in 586 BC. It gets torn down. They go into captivity, and everything's messed up for them. But God promises they're going to be restored, and he does restore them, but they got no temple. And then that's Babylon. Then the Persians come on the scene, and Cyrus, the king, actually, God worked in that king's heart to actually support it, give him funds, give him money to be able to rebuild the temple, basically. So they go down, rebuild the walls, and rebuild the temple. But you see, when they built that new temple, they call that the second temple. Solomon's would be number one, considered. I mean, these terms are ambiguous somewhat, but the way they're used. But I'm just going to use the common terms. So the first temple would be Solomon's, of course, and then the second one would be the one that Ezra, Nehemiah, and those guys had built. Zerubbabel had built, right? And so that'd be in the 400 BC. But one thing that did not exist in this temple, the Ezra and Nehemiah temple, was the glory of God. There was no more of the Shekinah glory there. That would be the temple that Jesus, that was in existence when Jesus is speaking in Matthew 24, would be what's called the second temple. So that second temple, the disciples are pretty worked up and excited about all these beautiful buildings and all that stuff. And Jesus said, but not one of these stones is going to be left upon another that's not going to be thrown down. He's talking about, 40 years later, and when Titus, the Roman general, comes in and destroys the city, the temple, and absolutely every single rock is turned over. And so, but now when we read in what Jesus talked about the future, Matthew 24:15 and 2 Thessalonians 2, when the Antichrist sits in the temple of God proclaiming to be God, that doesn't exist, right? Because in 70 AD, the temple Jesus was seeing and talking about, and the disciples were referring to, is gone. It's been destroyed by 70 AD. Yeah.
How does the temple that Herod built fit into that? So
what's happening here, the temple here, the third one, it says Ezra and Nehemiah, is, I guess I'll show that more particulars on next week's little, the whole visual. But the Romans took over Israel about 63 BC, right? And so they still got the Ezra and Nehemiah temple, and so that's what's existence. And he comes in and he decides after some time he's tried to convince them about 23 BC, and they go, oh no, you're not, because he wanted to take the temple apart and rebuild it from the ground up. You can imagine what the Jews thought. Wait a minute, you want to destroy the existing temple? Wait a minute now. What makes us think that you're going to actually build it after you take it down? So they're concerned. But by 20 BC, they worked out something. It took them 3 years to figure out what they're going to do. And so what they've done is Herod decided to build a little bit more to the temple. Build it up, rebuild it, make it look better. The area, the courtyard, and everything was run down. So sometimes that's called, the second temple is also called Herod's temple. That's why I say sometimes it's kind of ambiguous, because the Ezra and Nehemiah Zerubbabel temple is the second temple, which is also called Herod's temple, which is the one Jesus saw. I don't know. I don't really like calling it Herod's temple. I mean, it doesn't sound right to call it a Roman so-called king, to call it his temple, but it is one and the same building. They just call that because in fact, they never finished the job. They started in 20 BC, and they've been working on it. And by the time 70 AD came and they destroyed the temple completely, they still weren't even finished with the job. You know, you've been to people's houses when they do remodels, and it takes forever. Well, this was a forever remodel going on the temple, and Herod, I think it seemed he was hoping to just get their favor. If I do these nice things, maybe those Jews will stop being so mean to me, right? Didn't work. They're Jews, and so they have a tendency to be stiff-necked, as we know from the wanderings in the wilderness and all that. So that's that. And then the next one is the 70th week temple, right? The fourth item over. 70th week temple is the one that doesn't exist yet, right? The one that Paul just referred to, that Jesus refers to, that the Antichrist will break his covenant in the middle of the week. And so that's where we are now. And of course, there is that last one, the millennial temple, in that you go to Ezekiel 40 through 48, you want to learn a lot of details. There's a lot said about that temple. So that's specific, and it's given details that is so much different than any of the temples before, than the wilderness tabernacle and Solomon's temple. It's completely different. It's much larger. It's not even comparable in size. In fact, I have some charts that kind of put like a football field and compare it to the different temples, and you see that the one in the future in the millennial kingdom is really going to be a big temple. But in the meanwhile, what we're looking at for the context of prophecy is the 70th week temple, which is a future temple that doesn't exist. Again, there's several prophecies referring to it, and Jesus is just one of them, and Paul's another. I guess I can go to a number of passages that allude to it. Revelation 11 actually refers to it, and he talks about measuring the temple. And he said, don't measure it. It's been given to the Gentiles for 42 months. So the impression is there's going to be a temple that doesn't exist today in Jerusalem, and that's a pretty important idea. So, if you've ever been to Israel, how many times have you gone to Israel? Well, okay, I'll come over here. All three of us, okay. So 3 of us have. And I got to say, it was a God thing that I was able to go, because I was saved March 26, 1981, and just a few months later, we were in the Mediterranean. I'm a new believer, and I got to go to Israel, so it was just a real blessing, a work of the Lord. So you come in here, and you're looking at this area here, and Jesus, what did he say in verse 2? Not one stone, talking about the temple, not one stone will be left upon another. And the reason that's true is because when they took it apart, they carted off those rocks, because they were very square. They were beautiful for buildings, so they carted off a number of those rocks to build public buildings and things in Rome and in other areas that needed them. So a lot of this went a long way. A lot of these stones went somewhere else to build other buildings. And so, but Jesus' comment is that there's not going to be one stone left upon another. And when you look at this and you see, does everyone know what that's called?
Wailing Wall.
Yeah, the Wailing Wall, which is the western wall, the western side of the city. And so, what do they think that they're praying towards when they pray? They think they're praying towards the temple, right? So they think they're praying towards the temple, which, it's not directly to the what is it called? Dome of the Rock, right? They're praying a little bit to the south of it, but the bottom line is they think they're praying towards the temple, which means they think these stones are part of the western wall of the temple. That's what they believe. That's what they understand it to be. There's a lot of difficulties with that, and we're going to go through how in the world did they actually get to the point of believing that. Tradition is so incredible in the Christian world, as it is in others, I think, as well. Another perspective of the looking due west, due east, I should say, from the west, looking due east. And so it gets pretty crowded. This is a little bit more of a nighttime scene. So those are pretty common pictures. Everyone here has seen pictures like that. A little different rendition. Someone did a little bit of fun with filters and things to make it give it a certain glow and a certain color and all that. But anyway, we all know what that is. In fact, we even had a recent president that went here and prayed as well. Our Donald Trump actually went there as well. So a lot of people believe that right there, what they're looking at was the western side of the temple that Jesus was in existence when Jesus was ministering on the earth. So now there's a lot of different pictures, and I'm not going to focus on all of them. But you got the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They got their little mosque over here, and both of these are Muslim, of course, and they're way up on the top there, and this is way to the south. Okay, and so this is important, the south, as we progress on. I think you'll see why that's the case. So anyway, we got all these pictures. I'm going to move into that. So I referred to the fact that in 586 BC, what happened to the Solomon's temple was it was destroyed, right? Solomon's temple. So the question becomes one of, where was it located? Right? Where was Solomon's temple located in Jerusalem, in that region? And so, because it's getting torn down now, it was torn down pretty badly, but they were able to rebuild, and they think in the same area that they built before. But we'll see. I think we're going to see some details that are fun. So the second temple was not as spectacular as Solomon. So what happened is they go into captivity again, and 70 years later, they're actually able to. So again, they built the temple originally. Solomon's temple was built in around 960 or so, but around 1000 BC. It gets destroyed, and then they're 586, 515 BC, this is after the Babylonian, they were able to come in, right, and build a second temple. And you remember that many of you have probably read where they said the young men rejoiced and the old men wept, right? The old men that remember, those that are like 70 plus, because that's how long ago when they had the temple, they remember that the original temple of Solomon was larger, more glorious, and all that. And the new one, the Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah temple was nice, but it was nowhere near like the original one. So they're the older guys are pretty depressed over that situation. And so that's what's going on. So the second temple was not as spectacular as Solomon's temple. And so at this point, we're about 515 BC. We're moving forward into time. But this would have been the temple that Jesus would have seen. This would have been the second temple. So in 20 BC, they finally got started on rebuilding the temple area, which means remodel a lot of the buildings, that renovate them that were in pretty rough shape. And so that's when it started. But again, they never truly finished actually the job. And this is just a rendition. Drawings like this are just imagination a lot of times that people will have of what they think it must have been like. And I think you'll see why. So this is the temple of Jesus' day. That he would have been inside. He would have been with them outside with the money changers and all that. He would have, made quite a stir with them. So by 20 BC, this is before Jesus was born, of course. They start this temple to renovate it, make it look nicer. And again, Herod and those Romans were really just trying to appease the Jews, which were always giving them a hard time. Okay, so then again, you got Jesus in the temple, in that second temple, if you want to call it Herod's temple or Ezra Nehemiah temple, with the money changers and all that. Same temple, the same one he's referring to there, which would have got a lot of people pretty upset because a lot of people were making a lot of money in the temple, and your dove isn't good enough, or your lamb's not good enough, but ours is really good. You got to use ours for your sacrifice. Anyway, I'm sure I see a blemish somewhere in there, and if you bring your own, and the bottom line is they're just trying to manipulate and make money off of the people. So Rome, under the leadership of Titus, I'm just moving forward, destroyed the city and the temple in 70 AD, and so it was a dreadful event there. In fact, if you go back to the 60s, a lot took place in the 60s. There were a lot of revolts in the late 60s AD, before the temple was destroyed, where Israel was coming against the Jews, against the Romans. And when they did, they had a couple victories, little victories. They're like, oh, look what we did. God must be on our side. And Well, anyway, bottom line is their rebellion didn't last very long. By 70 AD, they meant business, and they really did destroy. Romans did destroy the entire city, and especially the temple, and it all got carted off, as we talked about. A lot of the stones did. So the Bible describes Ezekiel's temple being built on the same spot as Solomon's and Herod's temple stood. So that becomes a question. Okay, if that's the same spot, when we looked at the picture in Jerusalem, where is that spot? So we're going to break that down. Because, in fact, Solomon describes, the one in the Ezekiel, there's so many, those 9 chapters, 40 through 48, have a lot of detail about this temple and the conditions that will take place. It's going to be very different than anything we saw in the past. But the bottom line is it describes it as being wherever the original one was, because there's the Gihon spring, which we're going to talk about, was there, and it's going to be in the same place that the original ones were at. So then we always get that question, but everyone thinks that must be the place or near the place, or some like to say, in fact, some of the Left Behind series, I think they talk about building the temple right next to the mosque and be total peace and everyone's going to be okay with that. I don't think so. Can you imagine the Jewish mosque and the Jewish temple, rather, and Islamic mosque side by side? That won't work. And, of course, the bottom line is up on that area called the Temple Mount, we're going to see is not actually the place where the original temple was at. Jesus said unto them, which we just read, see that you are not worried, see all these things. Truly I say unto you, there shall not be one stone left here upon another that will not be thrown down. So again, when they see all those, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, supposedly is the temple, one portion of the temple, it can't be, or Jesus was mistaken. I don't take answer B to have any merit at all. So Eusebius, for example, and he was, of course, a historian, 3rd century, and he says the hill called Zion and Jerusalem, okay, in that region, the building there, that is to say, the temple, the Holy of Holies, he's being specific, have been utterly removed or shaken in fulfillment of the word. And I think he means the word of Jesus, that not one stone will be left upon another. This is, a couple hundred years after Jesus. They describe what Jerusalem looked like at the time. And there's no way of even telling where there was a temple. There was nothing there. Completely demolished. Josephus would have been there at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So Josephus says this, and of course he's a Jewish historian. It was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation that there was not left nothing to make those that came after believe that it had ever been inhabited. I mean, wow. I mean, there's no way you can even tell that there was a temple there. It's completely demolished, every stone left. And there's all kinds of questions as to why that was, because yes, there was a fire there, and there was gold in the temple, and some of it say they got in there to get out the gold, and they probably did. And that's part of the reason they took one stone apart from another to get any of the gold out of it. They're not going to leave that, obviously. And so the Romans knew how to take care of business that way. Okay. And then Elseroad was a commander at Masada, and so it would have been in that same 1st century area. It, being Jerusalem, it is now demolished to the very foundations and hath nothing but that monument of it preserved. Oh, the Western Wall, right? No, I mean, he's continuing, I mean the camp of those Romans, insert the word Romans, the camp of those Romans that hath destroyed it, which swells upon its ruins. In other words, it's the only thing that's still sticking up, the only thing that's still visible is the remains of the Roman fortress, where the Romans were actually dominating and ruling that city. And that's what Eleazar ben Yair said about that. And these are people that saw the destruction of the temple and would have known directly about it. There's nothing about the temple that can be seen anymore. Okay, so either Jesus' prediction that it was inaccurate, that not one stone would be left upon another, or perhaps the so-called Western Wall was not part of the temple at all. And so obviously Jesus is not mistaken, and the Western Wall isn't likely to be the temple at all. I mean, it's just not. It's likely to be just part of the Roman fortress, and we're going to see some details why. And sometimes we need to be able to look at the chimpanzee and think a little better, because there's a lot of people that really are amazing how they just turn off the brain to go so they can be traditional. So the Romans, this goes back to the backwards in time a little bit. The Romans took Jerusalem in 63, right? That's when they first took over. They first started dominating. So what would they have wanted to do if they're going to dominate a city? You know, they had been in battle with the Greeks, would have been the guys before that, and now Rome is an up and coming power, and they come into Jerusalem to take in power and lead. So what would you do if you're a general or a governor and you want to control a region? Where would you like to be located? At the highest place you can get, because you got the advantage of everything. So that just seems logical in that regard, that you're going to want to be in the high spot. So here's one of the questions. Here's where the traditionalists have a real issue when they try to explain things like the Temple Mount was, what they call the Temple Mount, was where the temple was. Because the 10th Roman Legion is what was in Jerusalem. And between the 6,000 soldiers and the 4,000 support personnel, that's 10,000 people. So they go, well, where did 10,000 people stay? Well, they say, well, they stayed up here in the Antonia Fortress. Well, wait a minute. That's not even close to enough room to accommodate 10,000 people. So, I mean, but that's your answer. If you say, well, where did the Romans stay? Oh, the Antonia Fortress, it wasn't that large, relatively compared. It's basically a tower so they can oversee and see what's going on. They can look in all different directions and see what's going on in the city. So it doesn't make sense. They don't really, if you think that the so-called Temple Mount was where the temple was, and the Romans was, and all the army was somewhere else, the best they can come up with is Antonia Fortress, which doesn't work very well if you're really looking at the size of it and how many people were there. So it asks the question, well, what does a Roman fort look like? If you go around Europe and see what their forts look like, there's a bunch of them. This is a drawing in England, Winchester. And so the first occupation of this would have been about 69, 70 AD, so it would have been around the time that the destruction of the temple took place. But this little region, they always had a wall, and they usually had a moat around it, you know, the water around it, so it would make it difficult to get in. And without exception, the size of them is rectangular and 36 acres. That's how much they knew how much they needed. They knew how to build their forts. They had a plan. They used that plan over and over and over again. So, and then another place in Roman fort, also in England, and this is a Roman fort. It's also 36 acres. You can see there's a trend here. They're all built the same size. In this case, again in England. And the Byzantine Roman fort, you're going to get, this is sound like I'm repeating myself, but there's the wall and there's the moat around it, and the region inside of it is how many acres?
36.
Oh my goodness, you guys are good. Okay, there is a pattern there. They obviously have a means, and they plan. You can see the foundations of some of them, just the outlines of some of it, right? And then Hadrian's Wall, everyone knows what Hadrian's Wall is, right? In England, it goes all the way across the entire island, right? The whole thing. It's a Roman wall. But, you know, where they built their forts, they had that similar design throughout. And again, they're all 35, 36 acres every time, every single time. So this was a defensive wall that ran through the entire country. And there's another one further north up there with Scotland, dividing them with Scotland. Doesn't work very well. The Scots and the Brits always had fun. So you get the idea that when they built their forts, they had a plan. They built them the same. So I guess that you can move from one fort to another, and you still had orientation, how to get around and within the camp. Again, the same idea. That's the idea. It's 35 acres. They had a plan. So back to Israel, right? And so you got the Fort Antonia, which really, actually not even shown it here. It really would have been up here in the corner here, what they would have said it would have been, right? But the problem with that is there's so much more to it. Let me go to, I think, the next one where I actually have the verse, right? Because a couple of verses we're going to see that really are pretty difficult to explain. So Josephus, 1st century, he talks about Antonia Fortress. Now, as to the tower of Antonia, it was situated at the corner of two cloisters, colonnades, of the court of the temple, so that on the west and on the north. The idea was it was a tower. It was situated so that he could see, so it had the advantage visually over the city. And the idea is it was higher than where the temple was. Josephus again. Josephus then describes Antonia as the guard to the temple, and that it is located on higher ground. That's the point. It's higher than the temple. And I guess we've all probably heard people talking about, you're coming into Jerusalem and the sun's shining in at a certain time and it just glows with the gold. And I don't know, the gold's on the inside. I don't know how it made it. You've probably heard people, pastors and the people, teachers say, you come in and you see just the glow. It's the temple's the highest place in the city and everybody sees it. And I don't see how they can see the gold on the inside with the veils there. But anyway, I don't know how they get some of the stuff they teach. So many traditions out there. But the point is, the Antonia Fortress was a place. It was a guard place to oversee the city. So it did exist, but it would have been a higher place. So when did the tradition of the temple location begin? Okay, temple location being the idea that it's on the so-called Temple Mount, the big, by the way, 36 acre lot. It's the same exact size that all the other fortresses, Roman fortresses are. So if you go look at that, look at on the maps, and look at they're all going to tell you it's 36 acres. But yet that's where supposedly the temple was. So when did this tradition that hill way up there was actually not Roman, but was actually where the temple was located? Actually goes back to the time of the Crusades. Everyone loves the Crusades. Not really. I think it's a real stain on the name of Christ. Anyone ever talk to somebody about Christ and they bring up things like, what about the Crusades? They went in killing people and, believe or die. And, we just want we want to separate ourselves from that conversation because it's not something we even ever endorse. So about 1100 AD, 1099, during the Crusades, they were coming in and they went into Jerusalem, right? So they're conquering Muslims and they're doing all that, all in the name of Christ, right? So the invasion of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099, right, and that's when it took place. They conquered this temple and the mount, that region, that 35-acre lot. They conquered it because they conquered Jerusalem. They ripped off the crescent moon because they had their little Dome of the Rock, a little situation going on there, the Muslim rock. So they took off the crescent moon and they replaced it with a cross. Oh, that's great. You take a mosque and you rip it off and you put a church little cross on it, and now it's Christian. You see, the mentality is not. It's not changing the people, of course, just because it just says you're dominating them is all they were doing. So they took off the crescent moon, put a cross on it, and they called it the temple of God. And it was a phrase they used, the temple of God, which was actually Muslim, by the way. It had nothing to do with the temple. They actually know that it probably wasn't really the temple of God, but they're just commandeering the building and now saying it's Christian now. And so they called it the temple of God. And that was the beginning. It's not the ultimate reason they call it, but that was the beginning of a tradition. And this seems to have started it. And so, anyway, there's a little bit of pictures, not the best. I tried to get some of the cameras back there. They were not as HD. They didn't have the high resolution, so they're not quite as clear and crisp as we would like them to be today. But anyway, you get the idea. It was a dreadful time. All in the name of Christ, they were killing people and were dominating and going to war with people and saying, "Believe or die." Well, wow, that's really based on faith. And then they get their sense of victory. They got their crosses, and they're like, "Look at us, yay, we won!" And no, they really lost, I think, more than they know. So anyway, so they go in and they take off the crescent moon, they put the cross on, and they claim victory. But a little bit later on, about 70 years later, a Spaniard conquer. 70 years after the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, a Jew from Spain named Benjamin Tradella visited Jerusalem. He wrote that the so-called Temple Mount was the location of the original temple. You know what his evidence is? That the so-called Temple Mount was the location of the original temple. I'm repeating myself on purpose because he didn't know evidence of it. He just believed that must be it. This is where I would have it. Well, that's nice, but that doesn't mean anything. So really from that point on, that location was virtually unchallenged. You can talk to almost any Christian and you show them a picture of Jerusalem and they see the Dome of the Rock and they see that region. They go, that's the Temple Mount. Almost everybody would say that's the Temple Mount. It's just almost inevitable that they believe that. We're going to show you some text as to why that's not the case. Okay, so David's men captured the Jebusite fortress, would have been when he originally took over Jerusalem, right? Very early on. So David dwelt, I'm reading 2 Samuel 5:9. So David dwelt in the fort and called it the city of David. Oftentimes, when back then they would just take over a city, it'd be called after its conqueror. David conquered that city, and so it was called the city of David. And David built round about Milo and inward. So it is the certain area in Jerusalem is called the city of David, not the whole city. It's just to the south, just a portion of it. So the city of David is also called Zion. That's a key word. City of David, Zion, referring to the same place. And what was in the city of David and Zion? Well, the temple. We're going to see that in a number of passages. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David. So, Zion equals city of David. And that's not the only verse. There's lots of verses that show that this interchangeable. When you say Zion, you mean the city of David. When you say the city of David, you mean Zion. It's referring to the same exact area. So, the Lord was involved in this whole situation, of course. So the Lord required David to purchase a threshing floor. Many might remember that. He was told to go in and purchase his threshing floor, which would have been in, of course, the city of David. And Gad came that day to David and said unto him, Go up, rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. The Jebusite. Not sure I'm saying that proper. But the idea is he was told to purchase a threshing floor. And threshing floor, was the idea of you take the wheat and you would thresh it and you would spread it up and it would separate the wheat from the chaff and all that. The chaff is the bad stuff you don't want. You want the wheat, the good stuff. That's as a way of separating. God told David to do this and he did that. So God was involved with, David taking over Jerusalem in the first place, or the Jebusite region. So where Solomon's temple was located, let's a little bit more details. Then Solomon, 2 Chronicles 3, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. David was not able to. Remember, the Lord told him, you're a man of war, you shed too much blood. It's going to be your son that's going to have the honor of building the temple. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David, his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So he's saying the temple was built at the same place that the threshing floor was located. Right, is the idea. Wherever David bought this threshing floor and gave them the purchase price, even though he conquered it, by the way, he could have just said, I want it. God says, no, God says, you're paying for it. So he paid for it, right? So he got the threshing floor, he paid for it, gave him the proper amount, and that is the very place that they built the temple itself, Solomon's temple. Any questions so far? Hopefully we're tracking okay. I'm not trying to go back and forth too much, because I know there's a lot of history there. So the Bible tells us the city of David is where the true temple was located, the city of David, as compared to other regions, especially the other part of the city of Jerusalem itself. So you got the so-called Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock at the top there. And so you got that whole 36 acre lot, 36. And so to the south, you have this thing called the City of David. And everyone knows, even today, they know it is the City of David. That's where they found numerous things. And we're going to talk about those numerous things. The things that are associated with, of all things, the temple, especially what's there in the City of David. And there's other particulars that are really big. So again, and I whited out that, right, so you can just see that the section that's to the south, that's actually the City of David itself. And that's a rendition of where the shape is basically the same idea, the same shape. That was done by Bob Cornuke, an archaeologist. And a lot of this is based on the work of Bob Cornuke, by the way, a lot of the work he's done in finding the temple, the original temple. It were other things he was looking for as well, but one thing led to another. It became more about the temple ultimately. So in the 1930s, they had a pretty fair camera back then, 1930s. Okay, so they took an aerial. You see the Temple Mount region at 36-acre lot, and then to the south, the City of David. It looks pretty plowed over, right? I mean, very plowed over, right? And so that reminds us of what Micah says is going to happen. Micah 3:12. Therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house of the high places of the forest. The idea is that whole region of Zion, which is where the temple was, right, the City of David, was plowed over. And that's exactly what it looks like. I mean, there's nothing there at the time. It would be in the 1930s. Of course, that was before 1948, and they became a nation. But the point is, it's exactly what Micah said it was going to look like. And it doesn't say that, because this area up here, where the so-called Temple Mount is at, and up in that area, there's a lot of stuff going on there. There had been for some time. Not through for a lot of the centuries, there wasn't much. But in the last couple hundred years, there was more and more people coming into the area. But it seems like the City of David wasn't really being touched much until after they became a nation. And then you can see it becomes very popular in that region. So again, I'm showing you the same picture, City of David, the outline of it. It's just plowed over. It's not much going on there at all. This is where the City of David would have been where the Temple Mount would have been located. So you see, south of, yes. Yeah, I see what you said. South, yeah. So, yeah, that's the Temple Mount area, as it's called, right? The 36-acre lot and Dome of the Rock and the mosque, and then just continuing south, right? There's been the western wall, eastern, north, south is the orientation of the City of David. And it's only this region that is actually called the City of David. The rest of it wasn't actually called that. It was called Jerusalem. And so it's kind of interesting. Kind of like, do you live in Spokane? Yeah, I live in Spokane. Well, what's your address? If you have something sent to you, it goes to Spokane, but you actually live in Otis Orchard. I mean, it's almost like that. You live in Otis Orchard, but you could call it Spokane. They get the idea. They get the idea of where you are. But we'll be more particular, because when you want that letter to really get there, you're not going to say Jerusalem. You're going to say City of David, right? 1 David Way or something. I'm making up an address. Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the 36-acre lot up here, which is the high ground, the high-level area, which has the Dome of the Rock, Muslim, and their mosque, also Muslim, right, is on that area. And so what many Christians believe is that was where the original temple was. But it wasn't. It was in the City of David, which is just south of that region, and lower and not as high in elevation as the Temple Mount. This Temple Mount, we only call it that because that's what everybody calls it. It's actually the Roman fortress, which happens to be higher in elevation than the temple was.
Should we be calling it the temple?
Well, but if you talk about this area with anybody, Christian or non-Christian, they all know what you mean if you say Temple Mount. So we use that term because it's very common. But then the caveat is, I might call it the Temple Mount, but I don't think that's where the temple was, to finish the sentence, because it doesn't fit any of the details of what Scripture tells us. So, continue on. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the City of David. Again, the same idea. They're the same. Zion in the City of David are one and the same, and they're south and lower than the so-called 35-acre Temple Mount, as they call it, discovered by the findings of the Gihon Spring. Now we're getting more particular about geography here, right? So what was in the temple, what did they have? They had the Gihon spring, and Hezekiah's tunnels were underneath it, right? So this becomes pretty important. I have a small video.
These moments. Here at our feet flows the Gihon spring, the main source of water for the city of David. From here, the water flows through the heart of the rock to the Siloam pool. Today, you can choose between 3 different routes to get there. The Dry Canaanite Tunnel, which was recently opened to the public, a splendid scenic walkway above the ground, or this, a 533-meter walk inside the tunnel, carved in the heart of the rock, wading through the cold water. In my opinion, this is one of the most exciting experiences in all of Jerusalem. This tunnel was created by King Hezekiah about 2,700 years ago as part of the preparations for the Assyrian siege, and to this day it still conceals many secrets. In 1880, 2 youngsters were trudging through the water when suddenly one of them felt strange carvings on the wall. They brought a torch and discovered a rare Hebrew inscription dating Hezekiah's period that begins as follows. The tunnel was carved through, and this was the way it was cut. We're out of the tunnel, and here we are in the Siloam pool. In ancient times, this pool looked completely different. Today, we have only just started uncovering the pool that existed here in the First Temple period. But in 2005, impressive parts of the Second Temple period Siloam pool were accidentally discovered. The city of David never ceases to surprise us.
I don't just think it was an accident. They say an accident. Oh, they accidentally found. No, I'm not quite buying that. God has His timing and let things happen the way He wants them to happen. One of the issues with the temple was there were sacrifices. Lots and lots of sacrifices. And lots of sacrifices presented a real problem if you didn't have water. So Solomon was brought to the Gihon spring to anoint him as king. So that's what we read here in 1 Kings. So Zadok, which is a really interesting guy, he's one of the priests. He's technically a Levite, but he's a particular family, Zadok, is actually going to be the priesthood in the millennial temple. It's going to be Zadoks that will be the priests. It won't be Levites or anything else. It's going to be these guys because they're the ones who were actually faithful to the Lord. Even when others got all messed up and got whacked up, they seemed to stay close to the Lord. So the Lord is going to bless them in the future during the millennial kingdom. So Zadok, the priest, caused Solomon to ride upon King David's mule. Must have been an old mule. And that's it happened. I just always wondered about how that worked. But upon King David's mule and brought him to the Gihon, right outside in the region of the temple. So on the dedication day for Solomon, for the temple, right, there were 22,000 cattle, 22,000 cattle. This is one day, and 120,000 sheep. And of course, sheep and goats. So 120,000 sheep and goats. So cleaning up after that many sacrifices would require a large amount of water. And the only place in all of Jerusalem, in that region, where there's water is the Gihon, which goes through the city of David. There was no water on the so-called Temple Mount up in that region. There's no spring up there. There's no water up there. They had no means of cleaning it. And the Gihon isn't stagnant water. It's rushing, it's moving water, it's cleaning water. It's incredible. The Lord brings it out of the rocks and out of the earth to keep that water moving. So the Lord did all that so that the sacrifices can happen and have a means of cleaning and all that goes with it. They would not have had that. It would not have been an option up there. There's no water up there. It's just like cement, like trying to get water out of the floor here. Not going to happen, and that's what there's no way they could have brought up that much water for that much sacrifice. There'd have to be somebody saying, boy, you can imagine how much work we had to do to try to get the water up there. They didn't do that. They didn't need to. The water was right there at the temple where they were. The Gihon was right, is part of David's, city of David in Zion. So the only spring water in all Jerusalem is the Gihon spring. Look it up. Even today, they know that. There ain't no water up there, right? There's no spring water at the so-called Temple Mount. Maybe that's a better way to call it, so-called Temple Mount, because at least they know what you're talking about up there. They call it the so-called. At least they know what you mean, because you did at least use the phrase that they're familiar with. So no water up there. So the idea of Zion, the city of David, there's so many passages that make this clear. It's the sanctuary. Again, Zion is where the temple was at. It's called the sanctuary here. My holy mountain, Zion, city of David. The one up there, Psalms 2, my holy hill. Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 are messianic psalms, right? Where when the Lord comes back, and there's a lot of anger, and there's initially, why do the nations rage against him? And of course, he kills all the unbelievers and all that goes with it. But the bottom line is he goes into to begin the kingdom. Initially, there's a battle. Of course, it's Armageddon is the idea. But so Psalm 2:6 is that my holy hill. In the future, that same holy hill that the temple was in David's time and in Jesus' time will be the one in the future as well. So the question still becomes the one for the 70th week. No one knows how that happens and how long it lasts. Remember, the Antichrist is going to be in the temple claiming to be God, asking everyone to worship him. That hasn't happened yet. Again, one of these, like the Psalm 2, referring to the millennial, right out in the future, right? But there's still going to be one in temple in unbelief. We call it temple in unbelief because the Jews were not going to be in belief. So whatever they put together, it's for their own benefit. They think somehow it's going to make them have more favor before God or something. So anyway, the Zion is where the Lord dwells, which is the Shekinah glory. It's obvious when you look at the text. The city of David, Zion, the Gihon spring, and all that. The sanctuary, all those terms, all referring to the same place. It's all south of the city, very, very south. So the Ark of the Covenant was in the temple, which was in the city of David. Remember that going back. That was another detail. So let's see what it says in 1 Kings 8:1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is, again, Zion. They keep tying those two words together. City of David, which is Zion. So that's where it came out of. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was located. I'm not trying to make more points than that, other than in the temple, in the city of David, in Zion, was the Ark of the Covenant, which would have been not in the so-called Temple Mount, would have been in the city of David itself. So, one of the things that's interesting, I think we looked at this a few weeks ago for one reason or another. In Acts, I can probably just do it from here. Acts chapter 21, Paul's causing a lot of havoc with the Jews, which he always did. He went in there preaching the gospel, and they're like, whoa, I don't want this. And so there was a big riot in the temple area. Right? So the Roman soldiers had to quickly deploy soldiers to rescue Paul from the riotous situation. He was about to be killed. That's what it says in the text. They were intending to kill him. So Acts 21:32, who immediately took soldiers, is the general, right? The Romans he's talking about, and centurions, and ran up. Oh no, it says down, doesn't it? Oh, well, if the Temple Mount is up there, they would have gone. No, they didn't. They ran down because they were in the high position. The Romans were. They ran down unto them, and when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left. The Jews left from beating Paul. They were going to kill him. They stopped when the soldiers showed up. And where they come from? Well, they came from somewhere high. They came down into the temple area and saved and rescued Paul. I mean, there's hints of this in the text, that people would just look at them, kind of like people going, well, where was the Exodus? And they say that place they call the Sinai Peninsula. Well, if you have a Bible, you're not going to be there very long, because even if you go to Galatians, it's going to tell you that it's in Arabia, right? I mean, it's ridiculous how people have their tradition. They don't care. Well, I know what the Bible says, but it can't be true because we know that's not true. Circular reasoning, you see, and that's what's going on with the temple itself. Because it was so well destroyed that there was no evidence that it was there anymore in the actual location. So they can use their imagination, and this is a really beautiful place up here. So that's where they thought the temple must have been. So anyway, they came from the high position down to a lower position to rescue Paul from the riotous situation. And then we end up with, everyone thinks that that's a big problem. But is it? Is it really a problem? I don't think so. They can stay there all day long. It's a false religion. It's condemning people to hell. It's a false teaching and everything to go with it. In fact, one of these days I might actually do one study on Islamic prophecy. That's kind of interesting. It's very confusing because they believe that Jesus is a prophet. They believe that Jesus is coming again. They believe certain things that sound like, oh, they believe in, no, he's the Antichrist. And anyway, he's actually the Antichrist. They have the roles of people change in Islamic theology, which is very bizarre to follow. But and I have a chart or two that kind of puts together who's who in their theology because it can be really confusing. But the point is, that can stay on there, and then to the south, I don't think I have another, yeah. And so then to the south, they can put in the city of David, yeah, well, I'll kind of get down there. Better picture. Yeah, the actual city of David is, but the question still remains about this so-called third temple, right? On our handout, the third temple, 70th week temple. I don't know. Where is it going to be located? Is it going to be in the actual location? I don't know. It's in unbelief, because what happens to this third temple when Jesus comes ultimately all the way to the earth, right? That gets completely destroyed. And that whole region, there's an earthquake, there's two new rivers that's going to be flowing out of the temple. One's going over down to the Dead Sea, and one's going over to the Mediterranean. It's really interesting. I mean, when Jesus comes and he sets up his kingdom, that region is going to be completely transformed, where we're seeing the picture there now. Completely different. It's not going to look the same. And so my impression is the real temple will be at the city of David, but whatever the temple they set up for the Antichrist to be able to do his evil deeds, I don't know. It could be anywhere. 'Cause there's no reason to think that they're going to do the right thing. You know what I'm saying? They're in unbelief. They're praying to a wall right now. I'm saying that sarcastically, but they're praying to a wall that they think is towards the temple, the original temple. Well, they're not. They're in unbelief. So they could build a temple over here, and the Antichrist goes there and does his bad deeds. So anyway, any thoughts or questions? There's a lot more passages and a lot more quotes. People, in the time of Alexander the Great, a historian writes that the temple was right about in the center of the city of David. They just state that right out. And anyone who's looking at it will go, well, yeah, that's not up here, that's right there. I mean, there's so many historians that wrote about it, but if you don't want to believe it, I guess you just ignore it and just believe what you want to believe. There's been, Bob Cornuke wanted to get with Randall Price. And if anyone knows, we're talking about people that are archaeologists, and they write books and they make a lot of money in doing that. And Bob Cornuke wanted to discuss the city of David, and Randall Price wouldn't have anything to do with it because there's too much evidence against it, and it goes against all the books he wrote. I'm just being real plain. It was really plain, because when you got books out there and all of a sudden you're going to say, no, my books were really off. And that doesn't bode very well for traditionalists. So anyway, any thoughts or questions?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Is that stream,
yeah,
is that the only water that's in Jerusalem?
Natural spring. I mean, they got physical man pumping water through plumbing. And I'm assuming they probably pump some up in some areas if they need it up there. But the actual natural spring, this is the only one that anyone knows of, is the Gihon Spring.
So that is the water that they drink, right?
Well, they would probably drink from it, but they also use it to clean the sacrifices.
How can you drink it with that many
Well, you drink it before it gets contaminated, but
above where.
and of course, there's valleys, Hinden Valley and valleys. So a lot of that would have rolled down into those valleys, and a lot of those were the dumps. They would burn things down there anyway on top of it. So they were burning the blood and other trash and other things, and it was a perpetual fire that they would have burning that would constantly be burning all the time.
So really, the city would have smelled really bad, right?
I would imagine so. A lot of people, they say it has that barbecue smell, or maybe worse. I don't know. So because they did have the burnt offering, and the burnt offering was completely consumed, right? And so they would burn it and burn it and burn it until it, basically is ash. There's not much of anything left to it. So that would be quite a sight to see how many the sacrifices and all that went on with it. And there's daily sacrifices and all that's part of our question, because in Daniel 9 he says the daily sacrifices halted. That means they'll be begun again. Jesus refers to that same event in Matthew 24, referring back to that same Daniel passage. So Jesus knows it's going to be there in the future, but that so-called third temple, it's just a big question mark. How long does it last? Does it last 3.5 years or 4 years or something like that, and then it's destroyed? I don't have no idea. But we do know it's going to be completely demolished, because this whole region is going to, because the temple region is so much bigger than you can imagine in the Ezekiel's temple. When it takes over, it's going to completely take away everything you see there, and it's going to be raised up even higher. And like I said, there's going to be 2 new rivers coming out of the temple. So they're going to be streaming down into the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is given life again. He says it's going to have all the fish that they had in the Mediterranean, and then the other stream is going to go over into the Mediterranean itself. Pretty amazing. It's going to be very different at that time. So there has to be, the point of all this is, there's going to be some kind of a temple to exist for the Antichrist to proclaim in the temple that he's God. That's the obvious detail there.
So it seems to me like they would want part of the Western Wall to be part of the temple. So it seems like it would be, down a little bit lower.
You mean the Jews? Oh, I see. Yeah. So
because they think it's so sacred now.
Yeah.
They can't imagine it not being part of the temple.
Yeah. So the Western Wall would be on this side of the mount, right, on the west side, and so somewhere in this region. So it would be right next to the mosque, maybe, or something down this end. I don't know where it's going to be, but something's going to exist that's actually called the Temple of God. Well, let me close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for this day. We just pray that we've learned some things that will open our eyes and help us to have perspective as to what's going to go on in the future, and know that you have it all under control. In Jesus' name, amen.